The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the Guardian cards in the Pallid Mask, the fourth Mythos pack in the Path to Carcosa cycle. I've split up the review of this Mythos pack into 5 parts to make it a little easier for you to digest. There are a lot of great cards in this pack, 12 new cards in all, so make sure you check out the reviews of the cards in the other classes when you've got the chance. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. There are 3 Guardian cards in this pack, so let's get started. The first card in the pack is a new skill. This is Inspiring Presence. It has willpower, intellect, and combat skill icons, and the innate trait. It has the game text, if this skill test is successful, ready an ally asset you control at your location, and heal 1 damage or 1 horror from it. Most of the classes receive a new skill in the Pallid Mask, and Inspiring Presence naturally has a very Guardian feel to it. 1 part Ashcan Pete, 1 part Emergency Aid. Inspiring Presence combines 2 effects that we haven't seen very often in the Arkham Horror LCG. In fact, our Ashcan Pete's free trigger is the only way to ready an asset in the game, and it's usually reserved to ready Duke. And up until the release of this Mythos pack, Emergency Aid was the only card available to heal damage on an ally. If you commit Inspiring Presence to a successful skill test, you get to do both effects, which is that's pretty cool. Inspiring Presence is also noteworthy because it's one of only a handful of cards that lets you heal damage or horror without actually taking an action. You can piggyback this on a skill test. The only other card in the Guardian class that lets you do that is if it bleeds from the Undimensioned and Unseen Mythos pack. There are 13 allies that require you to exhaust them when triggered, and Inspiring Presence can help you get a little bit more work out of them before they hit the discard pile. The only ally currently available in the Guardian class is the level 2 Beat Cop from the core set. If you exhaust the Beat Cop and deal a damage to it, you can deal a damage to an enemy at your location. If you're playing a couple copies of Inspiring Presence, you'll be able to squeeze a couple of extra damage out of your Beat Cop. You'll also be able to keep that +1 combat modifier on the table a little bit longer, which could make the difference between killing an enemy or becoming its lunch. Inspiring Presence makes those 4 resources you invested in Beat Cop go that much further, which is fantastic. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Ashcan Pete can also use Inspiring Presence to ready and heal the best ally in the game, that being Duke. If you exhaust Duke for either his fight or investigate action, you can commit Inspiring Presence for the combat or intellect icon, boosting your skill value to a solid 5. If you're successful, you get to ready Duke, saving yourself a card that you can use to ready him again later during your turn. I heard a few players proxied Inspiring Presence in their Ashcan Pete decks the moment it was spoiled by FFG several months ago, and I expect many Ashcan Pete decks are going to gravitate toward Inspiring Presence as one of their out-of-class cards. Other allies who are required to exhaust to trigger interesting effects include the 4 patron allies that have been released so far this cycle. Cat Burglar, Alyssa Graham, Arcane Initiate, and Aquina are other possible targets. It'll take some truly creative play to use Inspiring Presence with some of these allies, but it's nice to know that the option exists, particularly in multiplayer, since you don't necessarily need to be playing the ally yourself in order to heal damage and horror from it or ready it. That said, don't get too hung up on the idea of playing Inspiring Presence only on allies that exhaust to trigger their effects. It's important to remember that the card can heal damage or horror on any ally at your location after a successful skill test. Sometimes an investigator just needs to soak a point or 2 of damage or horror to make that final push at the end of a scenario, and Inspiring Presence can help them do that. Inspiring Presence is a cool card with a rare effect that is good whether you're playing solo or multiplayer. It's only going to get better as we see more allies that need to exhaust in order to trigger interesting effects. Until then, Inspiring Presence, it's going to help keep your allies on the table longer, and with all the horror flying around in the Path to Carcosa cycle, that is a very good thing indeed. The second Guardian card in the pack is ManoAMano. It's a free event that costs 1 experience point. It has willpower and combat skill icons and the spirit and bold traits. It has the game text, play only as your first action. Deal 1 damage to an enemy engaged with you. This action does not provoke an attack of opportunity. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the first card in the Arkham Horror LCG with the bold trait. It's a safe bet that we're going to see the bold trait crop up on more cards that you can only play as your first action. So how does our first bold card fare? Well, I really like the cards that let you damage enemies without making a skill test. So ManoAMano immediately catches my eye. As Agnes Baker players can attest, damaging enemies without making a skill test is a very powerful effect. It's also a fairly rare effect that appears only on a handful of cards, including but not limited to both versions of Beat Cop, Guard Dog, and Zoe's Cross, Symbol of Righteousness. ManoAMano is another source of direct damage that complements some of the cards that are already available to Guardian players, and I think that's fantastic, especially if you're facing down an enemy that you absolutely need to kill. Being able to do that damage without making a skill test is awesome. It's even more valuable if you're playing on hard or expert difficulty. If you're playing on hard or expert, you really want to try to minimize how often you pull from the chaos bag, since the variance is so much greater, and ManoAMano helps you do that. I could also see playing ManoAMano if you're relying on firearms assets for the majority of your offense. There's nothing more annoying than running into an enemy with an odd health total if you're equipped with a firearm, because it really feels like you're wasting precious ammo to finish them off. If you're equipped with a 45 automatic, for example, it's going to take at least 2 shots to kill an enemy with 3 health. However, that second shot isn't very efficient, since 1 point of damage is going to waste. You're better off taking a regular fight action to conserve the ammo. The trade-off, of course, is that your combat skill value for that skill test, not to mention your odds of success, are going to be lower, since you're not going to be getting the skill bonus from the 45. The difference between the two skill checks can become even more pronounced if you're using a high-powered firearm, such as the lightning gun from the Lost in Time and Space Mythos pack. The lightning gun enters play with only 3 ammo, so you want to make every shot count. Picking off a badly wounded enemy with it seems like a waste, but if I'm playing Roland Banks, I don't really like the prospect of making one skill test with a combat value of 9, and the other test at a combat value of 4. It's times like this that ManoAMano comes in handy. You can soften up the enemy by going ManoAMano, then move in for the kill with your gun. You get to conserve ammo, which is good, and you also improve the odds of killing the enemy in as few actions as possible, which is also good. As much as I like the potential of ManoAMano, it's also fairly restrictive. First, you can play it only as your first action, which limits your options considerably. You can't engage an enemy or take a shot at one of them and then play ManoAMano to finish it off. You've got to play the ManoAMano first. Secondly, you can only target enemies that are engaged with you. That means you're probably targeting an enemy that you engaged the previous turn, or an enemy that you drew during the Mythos phase. If you're playing in multiplayer, that enemy may not be the biggest threat on the table. And ManoAMano's targeting restriction also means that you can't use it to ping aloof enemies, such as those annoying whippoorwills in the Dunwich Legacy. Now, there is a workaround for the engagement issue. Fast cards do not take an action to be played, so you can play either level of taunt from the Dunwich Legacy deluxe box to engage any number of enemies at your location, then play ManoAMano to ping one of them for a point of damage. If you play Taunt to engage multiple enemies, you can still play ManoAMano since it does not provoke attacks of opportunity. That's awfully nice if you're engaged with multiple enemies. Suddenly those annoying whippoorwills that were going to reduce your combat skill value during your turn are fair game, and you can take them out before dealing with the other enemies on your plate. ManoAMano isn't going to be the first card that you spend your experience on, but it could find a home in a deck that includes some of the other direct damage cards such as Beat Cop or Guard Dog. If you're playing Zoe Samaras, for example, you could play Zoe's Cross, Beat Cop, Guard Dog, Taunt, and ManoAMano to dish out a considerable amount of direct damage over the course of a scenario. If you toss in an Inspiring Presence, you could do even more. I could also see players experimenting with ManoAMano in decks that rely heavily on firearms, just to help them make that ammunition go that much further. But it does have its restrictions, and that's something to keep in mind when you're building around this card. The final Guardian card in the pack is the level 3 version of First Aid, an asset from the core set. Level 3 First Aid costs 2 resources and has 2 willpower skill icons. It's got the talent and science traits. It has the game text uses 4 supplies, and if First Aid has no supplies, discard it. You may take an action and spend 1 supply to heal 1 damage and 1 horror from an investigator or ally asset in your location. Honestly, as a player who predominantly plays the Arkham Horror LCG solo, I've never been a fan of First Aid. I tested it in a couple of decks back in the core set only days, but I was never satisfied with how it performed. Like many of the cards in the game that require an action to play and an action to trigger, First Aid always seemed too slow and cumbersome. I never felt as though I could afford the tempo hit to play it, much less trigger it. These days, I don't even bother to use First Aid with investigators who could use the healing, such as Mark Harrigan. I've found Dodge from the core set, Emergency Aid from the Miskatonic Museum Mythos pack, and I've had worse from the Where Doom Awaits Mythos pack, as well as a few trusty allies have provided enough healing and or damage prevention to get Mark through most scenarios. Now, Level 3 First Aid is a significant improvement upon its core set counterpart. It comes with an extra willpower skill icon as well as an extra supply. When you take the action to trigger it, you heal a damage and a horror rather than a damage or a horror. Finally, you can target ally assets with it, making it the second card in the pack and only the third card in the game that you can use to heal an ally. If you've been happy with how Level 0 First Aid is performing in your deck, I think Level 3 First Aid is a solid upgrade to look at. So is Level 3 First Aid good enough to make the cut in my solo decks? Well, Level 3 First Aid is a big improvement over its core set counterpart, but it doesn't really address my biggest concern with the card, and that being the loss of tempo. Level 3 First Aid still takes an action to play and an action to trigger, which is a tough pill to swallow. However, that loss of tempo is mitigated somewhat by the fact that you get to heal a damage and a horror, which means you essentially saving yourself an action compared to Level 0 First Aid. I might be willing to take a look at Level 3 First Aid if it weren't for the second problem with the card, and that being its experience point cost. If I'm going to spend a pile of experience points on a card, I'm still taking I've Had Worse from Where Doom Awaits over this. Canceling 5 damage and or horror without taking an action is a much better deal than taking multiple actions to heal that damage and horror with Level 3 First Aid later in the game, even if that healing is slightly more efficient than before. Perhaps we'll see another version of First Aid down the road that swaps the action trigger for a free trigger and possibly an exhaust clause. Now that's a card I would definitely consider playing because it would resolve the tempo issues. But if you have been playing First Aid, I think in your decks, and you've liked it, I think for this version of First Aid is definitely an improvement and something you should consider. That's going to do it for my look at the Guardian cards in the Pallid Mask. I think Inspiring Presence is probably the most interesting card of the lot. Allies abound in this game, so the ability to ready them and heal damage and horror on them is going to be useful whether you're playing in solo or multiplayer. I also like the fact that you don't really have to take an action to use it, unlike either level of First Aid. Level 3 First Aid is better than its level 0 counterpart, but I'm still not sold on it. I've Had Worse is such a fantastic card, and I'm just not convinced that level 3 First Aid is worth the experience. But as I mentioned with my review of Inspiring Presence, sometimes you just need that to heal that 1 point of damage or horror to make that final push, and First Aid will certainly fit that bill if necessary. As for ManoAMano, I can see it finding a home in the right build. Direct damage is always good, but the card does come with some restrictions. You can work around those restrictions to some extent with fast cards, so it's going to be interesting I think to see where this card turns up in players' decks. That said, it's important to remember that everything I've said is just the opinion of a player who plays 99% of his games solo. And as always, I would encourage you to test the cards for yourself. You might be pleasantly surprised by how well they work in your deck. You never know until you try. That's going to do it for my review of the Guardian cards in the Pallid Mask. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Have you had a chance to use any of these cards in your decks? Please leave a comment down below. I always enjoy chatting with you guys about the cards that you're using in your decks. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future episodes. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter @manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.